In the winter of 1887, Pittsburgh stood as a monument to America's industrial ambition. Steel mills belched columns of smoke into the gray sky, their furnaces burning day and night, transforming the city into what locals called hell with the lid off. The Monongahela River ran dark with industrial runoff, and the air itself tasted of coal and iron. Yet amid this gritty landscape of progress, the city's elite had carved out pockets of extraordinary wealth and refinement. Mansions lined the streets of Allegheny City and Shadyside, their gas-lit windows glowing like jewels against the smoky backdrop. It was in this world of stark contrasts, where millionaires rode in gilded carriages past immigrant workers trudging through mud-caked streets, that one of Pittsburgh's most baffling mysteries would unfold. Margaret Adelaide Thornton was born into privilege in 1859, the daughter of a successful merchant who had made his fortune supplying goods to the growing industrial concerns that were transforming Pittsburgh from a frontier town into an economic powerhouse. From her earliest years, Margaret moved through a world of refinement that seemed almost fantastical compared to the harsh realities experienced by most Pittsburgh residents. She attended finishing school in Philadelphia, where she learned French, watercolor painting, and the intricate social codes that governed the lives of America's upper classes. Her education was interrupted only by summers spent at the family's country estate in the hills outside the city, where she would ride horses and read novels in the shade of ancient oak trees, far from the industrial clamor that had made her family's comfort possible. Margaret married Charles Thornton III in the spring of 1879, a union that combined two of Pittsburgh's most prominent families. Charles was the heir to the Thornton Steel Works, one of the largest steel manufacturing operations in the region. The wedding was a spectacular affair, held at the First Presbyterian Church and attended by over 300 guests, including several congressmen, railroad magnates, and banking executives whose names were already becoming synonymous with American capitalism. The Pittsburgh Gazette devoted an entire page to describing Margaret's imported French lace wedding gown and the elaborate reception held at the Thornton family mansion, where champagne flowed freely and a 16-piece orchestra played until dawn. For all appearances, Margaret was embarking on a life of security, status, and comfort that most could only dream of. The first years of the marriage seemed to confirm these expectations. Margaret threw herself into the social obligations expected of a woman in her position, organizing charity balls to benefit the city's orphanages, hosting elaborate dinner parties where deals worth millions were sometimes negotiated over brandy and cigars, and serving on the boards of various cultural institutions that were beginning to give Pittsburgh a veneer of sophistication. She and Charles had two children in quick succession, a son named Charles IV in 1880 and a daughter named Eleanor in 1882. The family lived in a 3-story mansion on Ridge Avenue in Allegheny City, a towering structure of red brick and limestone with 12 bedrooms, a ballroom, a library that housed over 2,000 volumes, and servants' quarters that accommodated a staff of 8. From the outside, the Thorntons appeared to be living the American dream at its most opulent, but those who knew Margaret well began to notice changes in her demeanor as the years progressed. Sarah Whitmore, her closest friend since childhood, would later tell investigators that Margaret had grown increasingly withdrawn and melancholic. During their weekly tea gatherings, Margaret would sometimes fall silent mid-conversation, staring out the window at nothing in particular, her teacup cooling forgotten in her hands. When Sarah asked what troubled her, Margaret would smile wanly and change the subject, redirecting the conversation to society gossip or the latest fashions from Paris. But Sarah sensed something deeper, a sadness that seemed to emanate from Margaret like heat from a banked fire. Other friends reported similar observations, that Margaret seemed to be performing the role of the happy society wife rather than living it, going through the motions with increasing mechanical precision while essential part of herself retreated to places no one could reach. The servants at the Thornton household offered a different perspective on the family's private life. Mary O'Brien, who served as Margaret's lady's maid for 3 years, would later testify that she had witnessed numerous arguments between Margaret and Charles, usually conducted in hushed but intense voices behind closed doors. While Mary could rarely make out the specific words, she recognized the tone of domestic discord, the kind of bitter disagreements that suggested fundamental incompatibilities rather than mere lovers' quarrels. Thomas Brennan, the family's butler, recalled that Charles often came home late, reeking of whiskey and cigars, and would sometimes sleep in his study rather than in the bedroom he shared with his wife. The household staff exchanged knowing glances but maintained the code of silence expected of good servants, understanding that their employment depended on their discretion. Charles Thornton III was, by all accounts, a man entirely consumed by business. He had taken over the day-to-day operations of Thornton Steel Works from his aging father in 1883 and had immediately embarked on an aggressive expansion strategy. He negotiated contracts with railroad companies, bought out smaller competitors, and invested heavily in new manufacturing technologies that promised to increase production while reducing labor costs. His success was remarkable. By 1886, the company's profits had tripled, and Charles had earned a reputation as one of the most astute businessmen in Pittsburgh's competitive industrial landscape. But this success came at a cost. He regularly worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and even Sundays were often devoted to reviewing contracts or meeting with business associates. His children barely knew him, seeing him only briefly at breakfast before he departed for the mill, and Margaret found herself effectively living as a widow, managing the household and raising the children with minimal input from her increasingly absent husband. There were rumors, though nothing that could be proven, that Charles maintained a mistress in a townhouse near the factory. Several of his business associates had made offhand comments suggesting as much, veiled remarks about Charles's extracurricular activities that were met with knowing chuckles and raised eyebrows. In the moral economy of the Gilded Age, such arrangements were not uncommon among wealthy men, who often viewed marriage as a social and economic partnership rather than a romantic bond. As long as discretion was maintained and family obligations were met, society was willing to look the other way. But for Margaret, if she suspected or knew of her husband's infidelity, it must have been another weight added to an already heavy burden of disappointment and isolation. By early 1887, those closest to Margaret noticed that she seemed to be reaching some kind of decision. She asked her lay wire, Edmund Whitfield, about the legal implications of divorce, a conversation that shocked Whitfield given the social stigma attached to such proceedings. He advised her that divorce would be difficult to obtain without proof of adultery or extreme cruelty, and that even if successful, it would likely result in her losing custody of her children and being ostracized from the society that had defined her entire existence. Margaret listened carefully to his counsel, but did not dismiss the idea entirely. She also began making subtle changes to her personal affairs, withdrawing small sums of money from her household account, consolidating her jewelry collection, and having long private conversations with Sarah Whitmore that her friend would later describe as having the quality of someone putting affairs in order. The disappearance itself occurred on the evening of March 15, 1887, a cold Tuesday when the last remnants of winter still gripped the city. Margaret had spent the day at home, supervising the children's lessons with their governess and attending to correspondence. Charles had left for the steel works at his usual early hour, and sent word via messenger that he would be dining with business associates and should not be expected home until late. This was not unusual, and Margaret made no comment when informed. She took dinner alone in the small dining room, picking at her food while reading a novel, then retired to her bedroom around 8 o'clock. The household staff assumed she had gone to bed early, as she had been doing with increasing frequency in recent months. The next morning, when Mary O'Brien entered Margaret's bedroom with her usual morning tea, she found the bed unslept in, and Margaret nowhere to be found. This was unprecedented. Margaret had never left the house at night without informing the staff or leaving some indication of her whereabouts. Mary immediately notified Thomas Brennan, who conducted a search of the entire house and grounds. They discovered that Margaret's warmest winter coat was missing from the wardrobe, along with a sturdy pair of walking boots. Her everyday jewelry was gone, but the truly valuable pieces, her diamond necklace, emerald earrings, and pearl choker, remained in their cases. Most curiously, a small leather valise that usually sat on the top shelf of her wardrobe was also missing, though the servants could not say with certainty what it might have contained. Charles Thornton was summoned home from the steel works, and his reaction surprised many of the staff. Rather than expressing alarm or concern, he seemed primarily annoyed, as though Margaret had committed some social faux pas rather than vanished under mysterious circumstances. He made only cursory inquiries about when she had last been seen, then retreated to his study with a bottle of scotch, emerging 2 hours later to send for the family lawyer rather than the police. Edmund Whitfield arrived within the hour and spent several hours in consulta with Charles behind closed doors. Only after this meeting did Charles agree to notify the authorities, and even then, he insisted that the matter be handled with utmost discretion to avoid scandal. Detective Samuel Morton of the Allegheny City Police Department was assigned to the case. Morton was a methodical investigator with 15 years of experience, known for his ability to solve cases through careful attention to detail, rather than dramatic leaps of intuition. He interviewed every member of the Thornton household staff, examined Margaret's bedroom for clues, and reviewed her recent activities for anything that might indicate where she had gone or why. The servants proved to be valuable sources of information, though much of what they revealed only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. They confirmed that Margaret had seemed troubled in recent months, but had given no indication that she was planning to leave. She had not packed any significant quantity of clothing or personal items beyond what she was wearing and whatever fit in the small valise. She had taken no money from the household safe, though she did have access to her own small private account at the Bank of Pittsburgh. Morton's investigation at the bank revealed that Margaret had indeed withdrawn money in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, a total of $300 in small transactions that would not have attracted attention individually, but represented a significant sum when combined. $300 was more than many workers earned in a year, enough to support someone living modestly for several months, or to purchase train tickets to anywhere in the country. The bank teller who had handled most of these transactions remembered Margaret as always calm and composed, giving no indication that anything was amiss. She had made no unusual inquiries about transferring funds or establishing accounts in other cities, nothing that would suggest she was planning to permanently relocate. The investigation expanded to the city's train stations and docks. Had anyone matching Margaret's description purchased tickets or boarded a vessel on the night of March 15th or the early morning of March 16th? The Pennsylvania Railroad station at Liberty Avenue had been busy that evening, with several trains departing for destinations east and west. Ticket agents were shown a photograph of Margaret, a formal portrait taken the previous year showing a handsome woman with dark hair arranged in the fashionable style of the day, wearing a high-collared dress and looking directly at the camera with an expression that was difficult to read, neither smiling nor frowning, her eyes suggesting intelligence and perhaps a hint of sadness. Two agents thought they might have seen her, but neither could be certain. The descriptions they provided were vague and potentially consistent with dozens of women who might have passed through the station that evening. One agent recalled selling a ticket to Philadelphia to a well-dressed woman traveling alone, which was unusual enough to stick in his memory, but he could not swear it was Margaret Thornton. Pittsburgh's docks along the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers were also checked. Several steamboats had departed on March 15th, carrying passengers and freight to destinations up and down the rivers. But riverboat travel in March was unpredictable due to ice and flooding, and most passengers consisted of merchants, laborers, and families of modest means, rather than society ladies traveling alone. None of the steamboat operators or dock workers could recall seeing anyone matching Margaret's description, though they acknowledged that the busy docks and dimly lit boarding areas made it difficult to notice individual passengers with any certainty. As news of Margaret's disappearance spread through Pittsburgh's social circles, theories multiplied like bacteria in warm water. Some whispered that she had run away with a lover, though no one could identify who this mysterious paramour might be, and all evidence suggested that Margaret had lived a life of rigid propriety, maintaining no close friendships with men outside her family circle. Others speculated that she had suffered some kind of nervous breakdown, a fate that reportedly befell many society ladies who found the pressures of their positions overwhelming. Perhaps she was wandering the city in a fugue state, not knowing who she was or where she belonged. Search parties were organized to comb through the parks and less frequented areas of the city, but they found nothing. More sinister theories also circulated. Pittsburgh in 1887 was a city of stark class divisions, where fabulous wealth existed alongside desperate poverty, and where resentment simmered beneath the surface of daily life. Some suggested that Margaret had been kidnapped for ransom, perhaps by some criminal element that targeted the families of wealthy industrialists, but no ransom demand ever arrived. No threatening letters or mysterious messages that might suggest such a plot. Detective Morton considered this theory carefully, but ultimately found it implausible. Kidnappers would have had to somehow lure Margaret from her home in the middle of the night without alerting the servants or leaving signs of struggle, then keep her hidden while making no attempt to profit from their crime. The scenario made little sense. Another dark possibility was that Margaret had met with foul play, either through random violence or at the hands of someone she knew. Morton investigated Charles Thornton's movements on the night of March 15th and confirmed that he had indeed been at dinner with business associates until nearly midnight, his alibi corroborated by multiple witnesses. The servants had heard no disturbances in the house, no sounds of struggle or distress. If Margaret had been murdered, it would have required careful planning and perfect execution to leave no trace of evidence. Morton did not rule out this possibility entirely, but he also had no evidence to support it. Sarah Whitmore provided perhaps the most intriguing clue during her interview with Detective Morton. She revealed that in the weeks before her disappearance, Margaret had spoken increasingly about her childhood, reminiscing about the freedom she had felt before marriage and social obligations had circumscribed her life. She had mentioned almost wistfully a cousin who lived in San Francisco and had invited Margaret to visit on several occasions. This cousin, Elizabeth Hartley, had married a shipping merchant and lived what Margaret described as a more adventurous life on the frontier of the West Coast, far from the social constraints of Eastern society. Sarah remembered Margaret saying that she sometimes wondered what her life would have been like if she had made different choices, if she had been bolder or less concerned with meeting others' expectations. Morton sent telegrams to San Francisco, inquiring whether Elizabeth Hartley had received any visitors from Pittsburgh or had heard from Margaret Thornton. The response, when it finally arrived after several weeks, was disappointing. Elizabeth had not heard from Margaret in over a year and had received no visitors matching her description. She expressed shock at the news of her cousin's disappearance and offered to alert local authorities if Margaret should appear in San Francisco. But she had no information that could help the investigation. As spring turned to summer and summer gave way to autumn, the search for Margaret Thornton gradually lost momentum. Detective Morton had exhausted his leads, and without new evidence, there was little more he could do. Charles Thornton made a show of concern in public, offering a reward of $1,000 for information leading to his wife's recovery, but those who knew him sensed that he was not entirely displeased by Margaret's absence. With his wife gone and presumed dead after 7 months, he could present himself as a tragic widower, earning sympathy rather than scandal. He continued to manage his steel empire with his usual ruthless efficiency, and rumors began to circulate that he was courting a younger woman, the daughter of a railroad magnate, with an eye toward eventual remarriage. The children, Charles IV and Eleanor, were too young to fully understand what had happened. They were told that their mother had gone away and might return someday, but as months turned into years, even this vague hope faded. They were raised primarily by governesses and tutors, seeing their father infrequently, growing up in the same mansion where their mother had once presided over glittering social gatherings but now felt increasingly like a mausoleum to a vanished past. Various alleged sightings of Margaret Thornton were reported over the following years, each investigated and ultimately dismissed. A woman matching her description was supposedly seen boarding a train in Chicago in the summer of 1887, but the witness could not provide sufficient detail to confirm the identification. Another report placed her in New York City in 1888, working as a seamstress under an assumed name, but when investigators followed up, they found a woman who bore only a superficial resemblance to Margaret. A particularly intriguing claim came from a missionary returning from the Dakota Territory in 1889, who swore he had seen Margaret living in a small frontier town, but by the time authorities could investigate, the woman had moved on and left no trace. The legal implications of Margaret's disappearance created their own complications. Under Pennsylvania law, a person could not be declared legally dead without a body or definitive proof of death, but after 7 years, a presumption of death could be established. Charles Thornton waited the full 7 years, and in 1894, he petitioned the court to have Margaret declared legally dead. The petition was granted, and Charles was free to remarry, which he did within 6 months. taking as his second wife Amanda Pritchard, a woman 20 years his junior. The marriage produced 2 more children, and Charles's first family gradually faded from public consciousness, mentioned only occasionally in society columns that recalled the mysterious disappearance of his first wife as a tragic footnote to his success. But Sarah Whitmore never stopped searching for her friend. She continued to follow up on leads and sightings, writing letters to authorities in distant cities, placing advertisements in newspapers across the country, asking for information about Margaret's whereabouts. In 1901, Sarah received a letter that rekindled her hope. It came from a woman in Oregon who claimed to have known someone matching Margaret's description, a woman who had lived quietly in a small coastal town under the name Mary Thompson, supporting herself by giving piano lessons and doing fine needlework. This woman had died in 1900, and before her death, she had told a neighbor that she had once lived in Pittsburgh and had left behind a life that had become unbearable. The neighbor, reading one of Sarah's advertisements, thought there might be a connection. Sarah traveled to Oregon at her own considerable expense, bringing photographs of Margaret and documentation from the investigation. The woman who had been known as Mary Thompson had been buried in the local cemetery, and several townspeople remembered her as a quiet, refined woman who had kept largely to herself, but occasionally let slip references to a previous life of wealth and social position. The physical description matched Margaret: the same height, the same dark hair that had turned gray prematurely, the same refined manners and educated speech. But without a body to examine or any definitive proof, Sarah could not be certain. The woman had been cremated according to her wishes, her ashes scattered in the Pacific Ocean, leaving no possibility of physical identify. Ion. Sarah spoke at length with the neighbors and acquaintances of Mary Thompson, piecing together a picture of the woman's life. She had arrived in the town in the late spring of 1887, carrying little luggage and offering no explanation of her background beyond saying that she needed a fresh start. She had rented a small cottage on the edge of town and had gradually established herself as a music teacher, patient and skilled with students, commanding respect despite her mysterious origins. She had never married, had formed no close friendships, and had lived a life of almost monastic simplicity. On her deathbed, weakened by pneumonia, she had murmured about children she had left behind, expressing regret mingled with relief that she had escaped before completely losing herself. Was Mary Thompson actually Margaret Thornton? Sarah believed so with every fiber of her being, convinced that her friend had made the desperate choice to abandon her identity entirely, to walk away from wealth and position and even her own children, in order to claim some small measure of autonomy and peace. But she could never prove it definitively, and when she returned to Pittsburgh and shared her findings with Detective Morton, now retired but still interested in the case that had eluded him, even he acknowledged that they would never know. For certain, the story of Margaret Thornton's disappearance became part of Pittsburgh lore, a mystery that defied easy answers and touched on fundamental questions about identity, freedom, and the costs of living according to others' expectations. In the decades that followed, as women's roles in American society began to shift and expand, Margaret's story took on new resonance. Some saw her as a victim of a rigid social system that offered women few meaningful choices, trapped in a loveless marriage with no legal or socially acceptable means of escape. Others viewed her as a pioneer of sorts, someone who had the courage to reject a life that was killing her spirit even at the cost of abandoning her children and everything familiar. The mansion on Ridge Avenue where Margaret had lived remained in the Thornton family until 1923, when it was sold and eventually converted into apartments. By then, Charles Thornton III had been dead for 7 years, having succumbed to a heart attack in 1916, still wealthy and respected. His first wife's disappearance a barely remembered curiosity from his distant past. His children from both marriages inherited his fortune and continued the family's prominence in Pittsburgh society, though none showed much interest in investigating what had really happened to Margaret. In the 1930s, a journalist researching unsolved mysteries from the Gilded Age came across the Thornton case and attempted to track down any surviving witnesses or family members who might shed new light on the disappearance. He found Eleanor Thornton, by then in her 50s and married to a Philadelphia lawyer, living a conventional upper-class life. When asked about her mother, Eleanor's response was revealing in its careful neutrality. She said that she had long ago made peace with not knowing what had happened, that she preferred to remember her mother as someone who had loved her but had been deeply unhappy, and that she harbored no resentment toward whichever choice Margaret had made. If her mother had chosen to disappear, Eleanor said, then she must have had reasons that seemed compelling at the time, and who was Eleanor to judge her for it? Charles Thornton IV, contacted by the same journalist, was less generous. He expressed anger that his mother had abandoned her responsibilities, that she had prioritized her own desires over her obligations to her children. He insisted that if she had indeed chosen to disappear rather than being the victim of foul play, then she was selfish and cowardly, and he wanted nothing more to do with her memory. The journalist noted the stark contrast between the siblings' reactions, seeing in them the different ways people cope with abandonment and uncertainty. Modern researchers looking back at the case from the vantage point of the 21st century have applied new analytical frameworks to the mystery. Some have suggested that Margaret may have been suffering from severe depression, a condition that was poorly understood in the 19th century and often misdiagnosed as mere feminine weakness or hysteria. The social isolation she experienced, the lack of meaning, full agency in her own life, and the apparent emotional distance in her marriage would all have been risk factors for serious mental health issues. Her disappearance might have been a response to psychological suffering that she could articulate to no one, not even herself. Others have focused on the broader context of women's rights and opportunities in the Gilded Age. Margaret lived in a time when married women had virtually no legal rights independent of their husbands. She could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts, could not obtain a divorce without her husband's cooperation, and would almost certainly lose custody of her children if she attempted to leave the marriage through legal channels. Disappearing might have been the only form of agency available to her, a desperate act of self-preservation in a system designed to keep women in their assigned places. Some historians have drawn parallels between Margaret's disappearance and the phenomenon of self-divorce, a practice that became more common in the early 20th century, whereby unhappy spouses simply disappeared and started new lives under assumed names, rather than going through the legal, social, and emotional trauma of formal divorce proceedings. While this practice was more common among working-class individuals who had less to lose in terms of social status and could more easily disappear into the anonymity of industrial cities, it was not unknown among the middle and upper classes. The difference was that wealthy individuals who disappeared left behind more visible gaps: property, social positions, family connections that could not simply be severed without notice. Financial records provide another avenue of investigation. Modern researchers have attempted to track the $300 Margaret withdrew before her disappearance, looking for any transactions or purchases that might reveal her plans. $300 in 1887 had purchasing power equivalent to roughly $9,000 in today's currency. A substantial sum, but not enough to live on indefinitely without work. If Margaret had indeed become Mary Thompson in Oregon, she would have needed to support herself through teaching music and needlework, supplementing her savings with earned income. This would have been a dramatic decline in living standards for someone accustomed to wealth, but it might have been a price worth paying for freedom and autonomy. The question of Margaret's children remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. How could a mother abandon her children, knowing she might never see them again, knowing they would grow up with questions and wounds that might never heal? Some have argued that this fact alone suggests Margaret did not disappear voluntarily, that a loving mother would never make such a choice, and therefore she must have met with foul play. But others counter that this view oversimplifies the complex psychology of desperate people in impossible situations. Margaret might have believed that her children would be better off without her, that they would have material comfort and social advantages she could never provide if she took them with her, and that her own mental and emotional state had deteriorated to the point where she was no longer capable of being an effective mother. The choice would have been agonizing, but desperate people make choices that seem incomprehensible to those who have never experienced such desperation. There is also the possibility, never fully explored at the time, that Margaret met with foul play, but not in the way initially imagined. What if she had attempted to leave, had made arrangements with someone she thought she could trust, and that person had betrayed or harmed her? The vulnerability of a woman traveling alone in the 1880s cannot be overstated. She would have been a target for criminals, confidence men, and others who might see her as an opportunity. If Margaret had fallen victim to such a person, her body might have been disposed of in a way that left no trace, perhaps in the river or in some remote location where it would never be discovered. This theory would explain why no definitive evidence of her fate was ever found. She had intended to disappear but had not succeeded in creating a new life because she had not lived long enough to do so. The case has inspired numerous works of fiction over the years, novels and short stories that imagine various fates for Margaret Thor. In some versions, she successfully escapes to a new life and finds happiness and fulfillment that had eluded her in Pittsburgh. In others, she meets a tragic end, a victim of the very freedom she sought. Still others imagine her living out her years in quiet desperation, free from the constraints of her former life but haunted by memories of the children she left behind, never quite at peace with her choice. These fictional treatments speak to the enduring power of the mystery, the way it touches on universal themes of identity, freedom, sacrifice, and the costs of living authentically in a world that demands conformity. DNA testing has revolutionized the investigation of cold cases in recent decades, allowing researchers to identify remains that have gone unidentified for generations. Unfortunately for those hoping to solve the Margaret Thornton case, there are no remains to test. Mary Thompson's ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean more than a century ago, and no other remains have ever been found that might plausibly be Margaret's. Without physical evidence to analyze, the mystery remains locked in the realm of speculation and probability rather than certainty. In 2015, a distant descendant of the Thornton family donated a collection of family papers to the Historical Society in Pittsburgh, including letters, photographs, and personal documents that had been stored in an attic for decades. Among these materials were several letters written by Margaret in the Mon before her disappearance, including one addressed to Sarah Whitmore but apparently never sent. In this letter, Margaret wrote with unusual candor about her unhappiness, describing her life as a gilded cage and expressing longing for a life of purpose rather than mere decoration. She wrote about feeling invisible despite being surrounded by people, about the exhaustion of constantly performing the role expected of her, about the slow erosion of her sense of self under the weight of others' expectations. The letter ended with a cryptic sentence: "I sometimes wonder what would happen if I simply walked away from all of it, if I shed this identity like a snake sheds its skin, and became someone entirely new." This letter, discovered more than a century after it was written, provides perhaps the strongest evidence that Margaret's disappearance was voluntary. It reveals a woman actively contemplating escape, using language that suggests she had been thinking deeply about the possibility of reinventing herself. The fact that the letter was never sent might indicate that Margaret decided to act rather than merely write about her feelings, that the time for words had passed and the time for action had arrived. Yet even this evidence is not conclusive. The letter proves that Margaret thought about disappearing, but not that she actually did so. She might have written these words as a way of processing her feelings without any real intention of acting on them, or she might have anged her mind after writing the letter. The gap between contemplating an action and actually taking it is vast, and many people entertain thoughts they never follow through on. The letter tantalizes researchers with the possibility of understanding Margaret's state of mind, but ultimately raises as many questions as it answers. The social context of Pittsburgh in the 1880s provides important background for understanding the pressures Margaret faced. This was a city and an era defined by rapid change and enormous disparities. Industrialization was transforming not just the physical landscape, but also social relationships and class structures. The old aristocracy based on land and merchant wealth was being challenged by new industrial fortunes, creating social tensions and anxieties about status and position. Women of Margaret's class were expected to serve as symbols of their family's refinement and success, maintaining elaborate households and social networks that demonstrated wealth and taste. The pressure to conform to these expectations was enormous, and the penalties for failing to meet them could be severe. At the same time, the 1880s saw the beginning of what would become the first wave of American feminism, with increasing numbers of women questioning traditional gender roles and demanding greater rights and opportunities. Margaret would have been aware of these debates, even if she did not participate in them directly. She might have read accounts of women who had pursued higher education or professional careers, who had challenged legal restrictions on women's rights, who had dared to imagine lives different from what tradition prescribed. These examples might have served as both inspiration and torment, showing her what was possible, while highlighting how far such possibilities remained from her own constrained existence. The Industrial Revolution also created new possibilities for anonymity and reinvention. Cities were growing rapidly, filled with migrants from rural areas and immigrants from foreign countries, creating communities where people could arrive with no history and no one to question their claims about who they were. The expansion of the railroad network meant that geographic mobility had never been greater, that a person could board a train and within days be hundreds or thousands of miles away, in a place where no one knew their face or their story. For someone determined to disappear, the infrastructure for doing so existed in ways that would not have been possible in earlier eras. The newspapers of the time offer a fascinating window into how the disappearance was perceived by the public. Initial coverage was respectful and concerned, treating the case as a tragedy that had befallen a prominent family. But as weeks turned into months with no resolution, the tone began to shift. Some newspapers began to hint at scandalous possibilities, suggesting that perhaps Margaret's private life had not been as pristine as her public image suggested. Others took a more sympathetic view, publishing editorials that questioned the pressures placed on society women and suggesting that Margaret's disappearance reflected broader social problems rather than individual failings. The case became a kind of Rorschach test, with different observers seeing in confirmation of their existing beliefs about gender, class, marriage, and morality. The investigation files preserved in police archives reveal the methodical but ultimately fruitless efforts to find Margaret. Detective Morton interviewed dozens of people, followed up on countless leads, and filled hundreds of pages with notes and observations. Reading through these files today, one is struck by both his dedication and the limitations of investigative techniques in the 1880s. There were no fingerprints to analyze, no surveillance cameras to review, no credit card transactions to trace, no cell phone records to examine. The investigation depended entirely on witness testimony, physical evidence that could be observed with the naked eye, and logical deduction. In a case where the primary evidence was absence rather than presence, where the central fact was that someone had disappeared without leaving clues, these tools proved inadequate. One particularly poignant document in the case file is a letter from Charles Thornton IV, written in 1925 when he was 45 years old, to a private investigator he had hired to make one final attempt to determine what had happened to his mother. In the letter, Charles described the impact his mother's disappearance had had on his life, the questions that had haunted him throughout his childhood and into adulthood. He wrote about the confusion and pain of not knowing whether his mother had left voluntarily or had been taken against her will, whether she had thought of her children even once after departing, or had simply erased them from her mind. He expressed a desperate need for closure, for some kind of answer that would allow him to make peace with the past. The private investigator's response, also preserved in the file, was compassionate but honest. After nearly 40 years, there was virtually no chance of discovering new evidence, and Charles would have to find peace without the answers he sought. The broader historical trend of missing persons cases from this era reveals that Margaret's disappearance, while unusual in its details, was not unique in its basic outline. Thousands of people disappeared in 19th century America, many of them never to be found or heard from again. Some were victims of violence. Others died from accidents or illness in places where their bodies were never identified, and still others deliberately disappeared to escape debts, failed relationships, or identities they found unbearable. The transient nature of American society in this period, with its massive population movements and weak systems for tracking individuals, made disappearing relatively easy for those determined to do so. Modern missing persons organizations that work on cold cases have occasionally reviewed the Thornton file, applying contemporary investigative techniques and databases to see if new insights might emerge. These efforts have been hampered by the passage of time and the lack of physical evidence. without DNA, without fingerprints, without any kind of biological sample that could be compared against existing databases or genealogical records, there is little that modern technology can contribute to solving the mystery. The case remains what it has always been, a puzzle built from fragments of evidence, witness testimony of varying reliability, and logical inferences that lead to multiple plausible conclusions. The Thornton family itself has gradually faded from prominence in Pittsburgh. The steel works that made the family's fortune was eventually sold and merged with larger corporations, and the family name, once synonymous with Pittsburgh industry, is now largely forgotten except by local historians and those interested in the city's Gilded Age heritage. The mansion where Margaret lived has been demolished, replaced by modern development, and there are no historical markers to indicate that anything significant ever occurred at that location. In a sense, Margaret's erasure from physical space mirrors her disappearance from life. Both have been swallowed by time and change, leaving only memories and documents as evidence that